does anyone here ever find life to be tough at times? Anybody? Who finds it to be just easy all the time? That's the hand to raise. Okay. Has anyone here ever felt as though you were inadequate to meet a challenge? It's all of us. I have to be honest, I wrestled for a couple of days about what God wanted to say to us from this passage where Jesus feeds the 5,000. It is a great story. It is an incredible miracle. But how does it intersect with our lives in 2022? And then I ran across these words from Chuck Swindoll. And they pointed me toward what I see as the emotional core. I think the emotional core in what God is seeking to say to us through this passage today. Chuck writes, sometimes life on earth can be a demoralizing struggle. Life can be tough sometimes, can't it? Some challenges loom larger than our meager resources. Some demands far outweigh our ability to meet them. Some answers float high above our intellectual reach. And some problems are too complex to solve. Let's face it, the world is big and we are small. And to make matters worse, we are naturally predisposed to think only on the horizontal plane. We forget sometimes there's an up to where we can look. And then he writes what we just sang. Nothing is impossible for God. Yet we habitually think in terms of what we have to offer and what can be accomplished through natural means. It's kind of our human dilemma as we live life. What can I do about it? What can I do? There's nothing we think sometimes I can do. That struggle, it is real and it's supported by the fact that the one miracle found in all four Gospels is the feeding of the 5,000 people. So note to self, if God puts it in all four of the Gospels, it must be important. It is a miracle for us as he seeks to communicate to us. So John 6, however you Bible, if you've gotten there, many of the verses will be here on the screen. But if you're looking there, you'll see that John 6 begins sometime after this. It's actually quite a while after where we ended in chapter 5, between what happened in chapter 5 with the healing of the man beside the pool and then the interaction that took place. This next miracle when Jesus feeds the crowd, several months have elapsed as Jesus ministers here in the northern part of the country around the Sea of Galilee. Mark chapters 3 through 6, Luke chapters 6 through 9, they record what happens between the end of John 5 and the beginning of John 6. There's a lot that takes place. John decided he didn't need that. He left that out. It wasn't needed to be able to fulfill his purpose, that people would believe that Jesus is Christ, that he is the Son of God, and that by believing in his name that they would have life. And so John takes some time to set the scene before he tells about the miracle. He writes, sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias. Now, if we were to make our pond down here, the Sea of Galilee, they would have been here on this side of the pond is where they have been, and now they sail toward the Highway 15 side of the pond, a much bigger pond than what our pond is. And a great crowd of people follow around, and they would have followed around this northern side to be able to get to where they are. They followed because they've seen the signs that he performed by healing the sick, told about in those other Gospels. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and he sat down with the disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. So just a few details. He went to the far shore, as we've seen, to be able to get there. lots of activity. Disciples, they need some rest. And they now go to this isolated place on the eastern side of the lake, but a great crowd followed. Word got around, Jesus was on the move, and the crowds followed looking for him. So he goes up the mountain. Jesus moves up the hill. He sits down with his disciples. It would have been a picturesque scene, I think, looking out there. But they likely needed some time just to talk and reflect about what was happening. From the other Gospels, we know that they have just found out that John the Baptist has been beheaded. Now, if anyone knew John, they know that his eternity is definitely secure. Jesus knew that. But this was his cousin, and this was a sign of the times. And the one who had prepared the way for him was gone, and it had to hit him. It had to hit him hard to think that's what had happened to John. And then the Jewish Passover was near. John returns us as readers back to a more precise timeline where we can begin to lock it in place. Another trip to Jerusalem, it's on the horizon. And so as Jesus has settled on the mountainside, we read, when Jesus looked up and he saw a great crowd coming toward him. And so the miracle that happens, it begins as an interruption. And you know, one thing about interruptions, we don't plan for them. But one of the largest church picnics in history, it wasn't on the schedule when the time began, but it's going to take place because Jesus is buzzworthy. The paparazzi, they are stalking him. I think, to put it in terms that I understand, he is a bigger deal than what Tiger Woods is at the Masters golf tournament. Jesus looks up, and here comes this crowd of people. We know what interruptions are like. We don't like them. The account here teaches us that interruptions may be divine appointments that God arranges for us, that God has a plan, that plan is unfolding, and great things are possible from what we interpret as being an interruption. It's a good lesson for us to note. And so as we look at this miracle, the key to understanding is to see the lessons contained in the miracle. It is a miracle filled with lessons, and there are even some leftovers. We're going to look at 3 lessons. The first lesson is the lesson of the yardstick. This particular yardstick came from the Antique Trove, 2020 North Scottsdale Road, Scottsdale, Arizona. It was a yardstick that Judy's parents had. Also, they had locations in Roseville, California, and San Carlos, California, in case, just to give full. They spent the money for the advertising. We should honor that. But the yardstick lesson is how we measure things, it matters. We learn from this lesson that we shouldn't measure a problem or a challenge by our abilities to be able to handle it. And so as Jesus sees the throngs of people approaching, he realizes here is an opportunity to be able to teach the people. He also realizes they're out here in the wilderness and the people are going to be hungry, and so he turns to Philip. Be Philip in this story. He turns to Philip and asks, where can we buy bread to feed all these people? Where can we buy bread to feed all of these people? John immediately adds Jesus has a reason for asking this question. John says he was testing Philip, for he already knew what he was going to do. Jesus, I think, chose Philip for this test because Philip is the statistical pessimist. The statistical pessimist in the group. Almost every group has one of those. Someone who will quickly calculate the size of the need and the inadequate resources available to be able to meet that need. It's not going to work. And most of us probably have a fair amount of Philip in us. Through this miracle, Jesus teaches us this lesson. Don't measure problems and challenges according to our capabilities, your capabilities, where we've kind of drawn out, here's what we're able to do. Here's how much we can handle. The lesson goes even deeper than that. We learn God sends challenges. He sends those challenges to test us so that we will learn to depend on Him and not on our own limited resources and abilities, because God loves impossible circumstances. Jesus being born seemed impossible to a young girl who was still a virgin. But the angel told Mary, nothing is impossible with God. A few weeks ago, we saw Jesus heal a helpless, hopeless man who'd not been able to walk for 38 years. We see God doing the impossible over and over and over again. He specializes in the impossible, and He did the impossible then, and He can still do it now. And that's where the challenge comes for us. If there is a situation you are facing that seems impossible, we all face them. As the disciples consider how to provide food for this huge crowd, keep your situation in mind today. Be Philip. Keep your situation there and let Jesus talk to you. Think about this. How much power does God have? How much power does God have? Now, the word that we use for that is the word, what's the word? Do you know the word? Anybody know the word? Omnipotence. That's the word. All powerful. He is all powerful. What would be impossible for an all-powerful God? Nothing. So it seems to me that the words omnipotent and impossible should never be in the same dictionary. At least for the Christian, they should never be in our dictionary. And so Jesus asked Philip where they can buy bread for the people as a test. He knows faith needs to be tested. Why would Jesus do that? He does it not to discourage us, not to depress us, not to cause us to fail. He does it to show us that what He can do in and through us as we trust Him. If we're not tested and not stretched, we're never going to have to trust Him. So there are benefits we receive that we'll never have any other way. Here are 3 of them. I just listed them for you so you can know what they are. God allows us to face impossible situations to stretch our undeveloped faith. He does that to strengthen our eternal hope. He does it to show us His incredible love. And I noted those words, faith, hope, and love. Is there any place else you've ever seen those 3 words grouped together? 1 Corinthians 13, we read, and now these 3 remain, faith, hope, and love. God develops those within us. But the greatest of these is love. So how does Philip do on his test? Well, not real well. Jesus asked, where can we buy bread? Philip asked, how much is it going to cost? We've been studying the Gospel of John. He asked a different question, and he tries to change the subject. Now, as we've been studying the Gospel of John, we saw how Jesus turned water into wine, didn't we? We saw that. Philip was there. He saw it happen. He could have just said something like, Jesus, I saw you turn water into wine. You made something out of nothing. So when you ask me, where can we buy bread? There aren't any stores anywhere near us at all. So I'm going to count on you. I'm going to count on you, Jesus. Now take your situation, and Jesus is saying to you, what are you going to do about what you see as your impossible situation? And we go, well, I need to try this, I need to try this, when what He's waiting for us to do is to say, Jesus, I'm going to turn to you. So instead of turning to Jesus, Philip points out how much money it's going to take to be able to even provide just a small snack for people. It's money they don't have. And so Philip says, even if we worked for months, we wouldn't have enough money to feed them. Have you ever done that? God asks you something and you answer Him with a different question. When God asks a question, listen carefully to the question. Many times the answer is in the question. Where should we go? Answer, we should go to you. We should go to you, Jesus. And so the lesson of the yardstick is about how to measure things. If I could stop measuring things by my abilities, I would have a lot less stress and anxiety. And so when you find yourself worrying, ask yourself this question: am I measuring this by my abilities, my capabilities alone? If you are, you have a really good reason to worry, if that's how you're doing it. We're not built to handle things on our abilities alone. We're built to trust God. That's the yardstick question, their test. Next, we have the scales test. The scales test. This is a small food scale with a dead battery, so I can't show you how it works. There's another disciple named Andrew. We read, another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many? And so the focus shifts to Andrew and how to weigh things. How do you weigh a problem? How do you weigh an opportunity to trust God? The second lesson is this. We learn that little becomes much in the hands of Jesus. It may not weigh much on the scale, but when you put it into the hands of Jesus, it becomes incredibly great. Now, the comparison between Philip and Andrew, it offers insights. The problem is the same. Their perspectives are different, but their conclusion ends up being the same. It's impossible. Just impossible. Philip looks at the problem, and it's impossible because they don't have enough money to buy even a bite for people to eat. It would take too much, is what Philip concludes. Andrew goes looking for food. He finds one boy who has a small lunch, and he says it's impossible because we have too little. And so it shows that we can look at a problem from differing angles and still not see it the way that God does. Philip looks at the crowds, but not at Jesus. Andrew looks at the loaves, but he doesn't look at the Lord. Both missed the answer. I look at Andrew, and I see a lot of myself in him, because he goes one sentence too far. He should have known when to keep his mouth shut. He's found the boy with the lunch. Here are 5 small barley loaves. There's 2 small fish. He should have stopped right there. But he had to go on. But how far will they go among so many? He could have told the boy, we'll give your lunch to Jesus, and we'll see what he can do with it. Everything in Andrew's statement weighs the inadequacy of what's available. The Greek word for boy is a double diminutive. Now, I know that's a technical term, but it's really instructive. He was not just a boy, he was a little boy. He doubles down on the smallness when he writes. And the lunch consisted of 5 small loaves and 2 small fish. So what we have here is a small boy, his small lunch for a big, big challenge. So what can we learn from these 2 disciples? Looking at Philip, we should ask this question. What have I decided in my life is too big for God? Maybe not even decided. What am I acting like is too big for God? It may be a habit you're trying to overcome. It may be salvation for someone you love. It may be direction for your kids and where they're heading. Maybe it's a change in careers. But a life situation where we're acting as though it's too big for God. I've got to handle it. When we look at Andrew, we should ask, what have I decided that I have that is too little for God to work? There's too little time, there's too little money, there's too little abilities, there's too little energy. Here's a question where you can fill in the blank. Do you ever find yourself in the place saying, when I get more fill in the blank, then I'm going to fill in the blank again? When I get more time, I'll get more involved in ministry activities. When I get more energy, I'll do more things with my kids. When I get more support from people, I'm going to be a better spouse then. So coming at this from either Philip's perspective or Andrew's perspective, the lesson is the same. Start with whatever you have, give it to God, and watch what he does with it. Whatever you have, give it to God and watch what he does with it. Examples all through Scripture. Moses said he didn't talk well enough. Jeremiah said that he was too young. Gideon's army was too small. Jesus was testing the disciples now, just as they had faced those tests in the Old Testament. He could have just fed the people, but he brought up the need. The need magnified the size of the problem. Then one of the disciples tried to at least do something to solve the problem. The resources available, they were not nearly enough. And so facing a need that is too big, with the resources available, Jesus has brought them to the point of faith, which is this. The crucial point when someone trusts God with what little we do have. When we trust God with what little we do have, and we put it into his hands, and we wait upon him. What we would rather do, what we tend to do, is to wait for someone who has enough to be able to meet the need. Enough abilities, or enough money, or enough time, enough creativity. No. The solution always starts with someone who trusts God with what little they do have. David was a young shepherd. He only had a sling and a big faith, and he prevailed. And here we have a small lunch and a great Lord. The Lord takes the impossible and uses what is available to be able to feed 5,000, well, we're told 5,000 men plus their family members. Estimates range from 10 to 15,000 people until they could eat no more. And look at how it happens in John 6, 10, 11. Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place. And they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. And then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks. Imagine the anticipation that follows the word and. They've seen Jesus do things. And I tried to anticipate the buzz that must have gone through what's he going to do? How's this going to help? And then I've tried to picture this. Is it Jesus just blessing and over again, breaking and breaking and breaking? I think as he did that and began to pass it, that as the baskets came down among the crowd, you know, you're there sitting in your row and going, oh, it looks like it's getting a low. There's not going to be enough for me. And then it comes to you, and you break off pieces, and you break off pieces, and you break off pieces before you pass it down, and you look, and as it goes down the row, the basket continues to be filled. Imagine the anticipation as this takes. And anticipate then what God could do, what God will do when we trust him. So why don't we anticipate? Why don't we anticipate? Why do we turn and think, I need to do something about it? To be involved in Jesus' miraculous work, we have to put ourselves in places where we can anticipate what God would do. What could he do? What will he do? I think we don't anticipate because we don't want to be disappointed. We don't want to pray for God to do something and then not have it happen and be disappointed. We're going to learn a lot more from the Lord if we will anticipate and risk being disappointed. Rather than giving ourselves an out by saying, I know God could do something about this, but he probably won't. He probably won't do it for me. Go ahead and anticipate, even if it means being disappointed, because then Jesus took the loaves. He gave thanks and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. I kind of wonder at that point if one of the disciples then would have had, been brazen enough. I told you. I told you. Jesus could. I don't think any of them were in that place. claiming that Jesus could handle it. When we anticipate and God does it, we can give thanks because of how great God is. And so 2 valuable lessons that we have seen. The yardstick lesson, the lesson of the scales. There's one more. It's the lesson of the spreadsheet. Any of you deal with spreadsheets? Spreadsheets. My daughter says she loves a good spreadsheet. So maybe you love a good spreadsheet. A spreadsheet, if it's done well, will give you an accurate picture of what's possible using what's available. A spreadsheet is a useful tool to calculate the results that could come. John describes the outcome. When they'd all had enough to eat, he said to the disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. It's fair to say that Jesus excelled in feeding the crowd. The faith spreadsheet used here reveals that every encounter with a problem or challenge, it can bring an increase. Now, there's an important filter applied in this calculation. God uses tests for our good. He wouldn't send a test to destroy our faith, or destroy our lives. A test brings an increase, and the faith of the disciples is strengthened. So the lesson here is this: an impossible problem plus an omnipotent God equals a certain increase. The balance sheet is going to go huge in your favor when you trust God. So begin with what you have. Begin with whatever you have, no matter how great or how small. Give it all to Jesus Christ and let him do the rest. I'd like to say there's a perfect ending to this miracle because they were flawed, imperfect people. That's not the case. We know that for the crowd, when the people saw him do this miraculous sign, they exclaimed, "Surely he is the prophet we've been expecting." They at least knew that much, that he's the one promised in the Old Testament. Surely he is that one. But Jesus saw their motives, and so when Jesus saw they were ready to force him to be their king, he slipped away into the hills by himself. And that's where we'll pick it up in a couple of weeks. They wanted to revolt. They wanted to overthrow Rome and make Jesus king. That's not God's plan. I'd love to say the disciples did better, but we know from Mark that they got into the boat, they're caught in a storm, and Jesus comes walking on the water. And in Mark 6, we read that he climbed aboard the boat with them, and the wind dropped. And then this may describe us, but they were scared out of their wits. They had not had the sense to learn the lesson of the loaves. Even that miracle had not opened their eyes to see who he was. They're still operating out of fear and not by faith. The lesson of the spreadsheet, not yet fully understood. So to bring this to a close, we've identified 3 lessons. We've identified the yardstick lesson: don't measure problems and challenges according to our abilities. We've learned the scales lesson, where little can become much in the hands of Jesus. And then the spreadsheet lesson: an impossible problem plus an omnipotent God equals a certain increase. From this, 4 principles to guide us in 2022 in being able to apply these lessons to faith challenges in our lives. Number 1, admit our own inadequacy and affirm God's omnipotence. That's where it begins. That we have a big God. Be certain as you do that the challenge, it's not just for anything. It needs to be a challenge that will perhaps glorify God. It will result in obeying one of his commands, or it will fulfill one of his mandates. That God is in it. He can make much of it. And then release the challenge back to God so he can accomplish it and he receives the glory. And then ultimately, do what you can, supply what you have, invest your effort and energy, and then trust God to multiply it. And then here's the tough part: or not. It's not prosperity gospel that we're talking about here. Trust God to multiply it or not, according to His will. That it's His will that matters.